We will get started right now. So thank you again for being here. Today's the final day of the conference, one which will be exciting, interesting. We have two keynote speakers today, Stephen Holl, one of the foremost architects, not just in the country, but in the world. And he will be our first speaker, and then we will have a break, and we will reconvene at 10:15, and our second keynote speaker will be the eminent Nobel laureate, Dr. Eric Kandel. And at 11:15, Dr. Holl and, Mr. Holl and Dr. Kandel will jointly discuss Mind, Brain, and the Art of Architecture, facilitated by Tom Fisher and Dr. Tom Albright. Lunch will be served from noon, and the remainder of the day will be clearly elaborated in your agenda and will be facilitated by Dr. Stephen Henriksen. We'll conclude with a wrap-up session with Tom Fisher and myself, and there'll be tours from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock. I want to remind the architects here that if you haven't signed up, AIA learning units can be received at the table, and they're sponsored by the Academy of Architecture for Health. I also want to remind everybody that today will be the wrap-up, and I want as much contributions from people in the audience as possible. We will have lots of time for questions and answers. I want to thank a few people from last night, and I congratulate again our two student winners, Mingyu Kim and Eugene Kim. We were very happy to make that award. And also to tell everyone that John Eberhard sent a note to us this morning with great appreciation of what happened last night. Sorry that he couldn't be here, but he said that he was here in his heart. We're supposed to have Marvin Malika here to make a few comments and discuss briefly the program we have at New School. So I'll just touch on that to make sure that it is covered. And that is that at New School, we have a track, and that track is in healthcare and neuroscience and architecture. And with us today, Kurt Hunker, I don't think is here. Kurt, oh, well, sorry, I missed you. Kurt, would you like to say a few words about the program? So come to the microphone if you would. But I also see that Tatiana Berger is right in the audience, and she's one of the teachers, and Michael Arbid, who we are fortunate to have teaching that program. Kurt, if you just say a few words about the program, we'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Gil, and good morning, everyone. We've developed a certificate program in neuroscience based on the coursework that we've been offering now, something on the order of a dozen years, and we bring architects and neuroscientists together to teach and to help students see the potential for these connections between the two disciplines. There's a three-quarter sequence of courses, and then students have the option to pursue a design studio project with a neuroscience basis after that. So we're very pleased about that. We've had our first group of certificate students go through the program last year, and I'm happy to answer questions and chat further at some later point during the day. Thanks, Gil.
So in Marvin's absence, we're going to have Tom Fisher come to the podium, please.
Thank you, Gil. It's my privilege to introduce our first speaker, Stephen Holl. Stephen just got married on September 15th in Santorini, Greece, and so he flew from there to here. So congratulations, Stephen. I guess this is what a honeymoon can look like. He said his wedding took 10 minutes and the baptism of his daughter took an hour. So I've known Stephen a long time. For years, I was the editor of one of the major journals in our field, and I had an opportunity to write about his work. And what always has impressed me about his work is that it begins with ideas. And it also, many of his ideas are inspired by and in some ways grounded in science. He once told me that his favorite part of the New York Times was the Thursday science section. And so I think you'll hear in his remarks this morning that science and art and creativity are very much a part of his work. Later on then, when I went to Minnesota as their dean, I had the opportunity to work with Stephen as the client of one of his buildings. So I have the privilege every day of working in a Stephen Holl building, and he was really a delight to work with in those years. And so we are so fortunate to have, as Gil said, one of the great architects of the world here, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say about art, science, creativity, and everything else. So please welcome Stephen Holl.
I would say, Tom, thank you very much. I would say my wife is an architect, Demita Zakrelia, and she said, oh, you can't miss that talk at the Salk. And also because Eric Kandel is going to be there. So, I mean, there was a lot of, discussion about not having a honeymoon, but we decided this is more important. In fact, also, I've been here a number of times, but I was watching everyone clap at the sunset last night. This is one of the great sights of Lou Kahn's work. I think I've been to every Lou Kahn building, but I like the statement, architecture does not exist. What exists is the spirit of architecture. This day is also interesting because I had just discovered Eric Kandel's book I think it was in the New York Review of Books. They had just cited it in the piece of paper that was on my desk. And then just the day before I left, the art newspaper came, and there's a whole page devoted to this book. So I've read 3/4 of it on the plane. This is like very, very fresh, and I have to say this is one of the great books on this subject that you'll ever read. It's fantastic, and it was an interesting moment in my office because it came the day before I left, and I noticed the dedication is to Lee Bollinger, who has created an environment at Columbia University that encourages the bridging of cultures. And I never talked to Lee. He's there's like 40,000 people under him, President Bollinger at Columbia. But I sent him an email. I said, Lee, how are you? I'm going to be speaking next to Eric Kandel at the Salk. I'm so honored. And he shot back the answer in about 5 minutes, from very busy. I'm sure he gets so many emails that are so nasty, asking for this and that. Somebody probably said, here's a positive email, answer it. So I organized this into 5 sections. It's very crude because I just kind of brought it together while I was traveling. And I try to use my buildings to illustrate points, not to illustrate the buildings. So the buildings are getting short-circuited to these 5 points that I'm trying for. Environment, body, brain, mind, concept, phenomena, which is the way I work, psychological space, which is something from my childhood, light, exciting neural networks, and city, room, body, and space. And the talk will be about 50 minutes, and it's divided so that there are 3 little videos. I hope they play, so you'll know where we are, because the last one is about the body, the middle one is about the room, and the first one is about the city. I made this diagram in Santorini, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's an amazing city on this volcanic Atlantis-like condition, and around the horizon is this beautiful Aegean Sea, cobalt blue. And I thought about the problem of the environment and how important it is as it surrounds the body, and we're talking about the brain. But I have this little dotted line in the middle of the brain, which I call the mind, and I insist that each individual soul, each individual being is unique. And so no matter how scientific we are, there will never be a positivistic way that we can erase that little dotted line around the soul, the mind, the individual. And this was my partner, Chris McVoy, said the human mind, he says, he sent me this quote, the human mind is open to immensity and the way the tidal basin is open to the ocean. So he said there should be a breach in my diagram linking the mind to the outside. Recently, I read this book by another Columbia professor, Siddhartha Mukherjee, and I was fascinated by the ideas in this book, which it goes through the deep history of the gene, but it brings up the moment of discoveries recently, in recent years, and one of the ones that fascinated me is the idea of epigenetics. That is, that something that happens to us gets imprinted on our genes and moves into the next generation. It isn't just a scientific trait, it's the environment imprinting. And he uses the example, a couple of examples, one of which is the famine in the Netherlands during World War II, where certain people went for years undernourished and passed this epigenetically on to the next generation. And I thought, in a certain sense, I always love this quote of Winston Churchill, "We shape our buildings, therefore, thereafter they shape us." In some ways, this idea of epigenetics is a kind of evidence that this quote, which is from 1944, now has scientific proof and will get to be more important as we go further. I've been working with David Shaw, D.E. Shaw Research, for years. He's been a client of mine for years. He made a fortune in trading electronically between Tokyo, New York, and London many years before other people were trading electronically. He took his funds and he's done a research on protein folding. I don't know this much about it, but I do know that at a dinner that I was with some of the people that work with Mukherjee, they agreed that, and he said that after the genome code, that protein folding might be the next kind of important horizon of research. And then we did his protein folding computer demonstration space on 39th Street in New York about 8 years ago. So, talking about my points, I would say going from the large scale to the medium scale to the small scale, and I have here, this is a project, I won't go into detail, I'll just show it to you, but it's formed by sunlight. The building is sliced by the requirement of 2 hours of sunlight to every building in its shadow, and that's how it gets its shape. This is, and by the way, in scale, this is the largest project we've ever done. It's 4 million square feet. And you can see it's like Rockefeller Center. You can see from a distance it's not an object building, it's a space in the city. It's really a piece of the city. It has apartments, a hotel, office buildings, and many cafes and restaurants, and a shopping center below this water garden. And it was based on a poem by Du Fu. The way we work, and this is let's say if the rest of this talk is about trying to connect to the science of this conference, this is a kind of bracket. And it's the way we work. As Tom Fisher said, I always work from an idea that drives the design of a building. Whether or not anyone realizes it when it's built, it doesn't matter. So I go from concept to phenomena. When a building is realized, there's a phenomenal experience. In fact, I wrote a book with Johanni Palasma, Questions of Perception, which is just about the phenomenology of architecture. So that was 1993. And I think Johanni spoke at this last year? He spoke at last year's conference. So this notion of the world of sensory experience, this notion of how we really experience architecture, to me is enormously important. However, I don't, that's an a priori. I think there's an a priori, and that is a concept that drives the design. Therefore, it has an embedded meaning. So, and I sort of feel, and this sentence comes from Einstein. He calls this logically unbridgeable gap between thought and feeling. So the world of concept and propositions, and now I'm going to show you the example of three different projects. One is chiasma. The concept was the intertwining, and it was realized. So this incredible space, the physical space and light of the building. The second one is nama. The concept was the stone and the feather, a contrast with the original building, and it was realized. And the third is the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, which has not yet been realized. So there's the first concept sketch of chiasma many years ago. This building opened in 1998, and it's going to have an anniversary in 2018, 20 years. The contemporary art in the middle of Helsinki. And the second one is in Kansas City. It was a competition. Again, architects have to compete against each other. It's such a nasty field that way. And there were 6 competitors. We broke the rules of the competition. You were supposed to build the building on the north side. We came down into the landscape, and I made the building a contrast with the original stone building, the stone and the feather. The 1933 was heavy, the 2002 was light. One had closed circulation, one had open circulation. And when I got to present it to the jury, and I said, the reason I had the nerve to do this, basically to break your site rules, is I noticed an inscription in stone on your 1933 building: the soul has greater need of the ideal than of the real. And unanimously they voted for us, and we won. And this building is really if you get a chance to go to Kansas City, I'm very proud of this project. Major museum in Kansas. Watercolors, from the watercolor to the reality. And this one, this is a different project, but this one has not been realized. So what we're talking about is just having an idea and not being able to communicate that in a full dimension to the people. This is at the Franklin and Marshall University in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and there was a solid brick rectangle building sitting amongst the trees. And our new building, it's for the arts painting, sculpture, studio art. And our concept was that the building should defer to the oldest thing on campus. There are trees on this campus that are 200 years old, enormous diameter, 4 feet in diameter, amazing collection of trees. And we made the trees, in a way, imprint their circular geometries on the body of the building, and the building rises up like a kite and becomes a kind of park pavilion. You can see right through to Buchanan Park, and it's all solar powered and has recycled water, and it'll be this wonderful space for the arts. And a building on a campus that's mainly brick and that's mainly neoclassical, and the president, Daniel Porter, was in love with this, as is the donor. It's an apparition in the park, and it brings, I think, the arts to the field, and also to invigorate the university. The interior spaces are all natural light, 25-foot candles, and all we have now is models. So when I think about this topic today, I think about my own life, and I think I had an intuitive feeling of the importance of neural networks in relation to architecture. Because when I was a first-year student at the University of Washington in 1967, a long time ago, they gave a project. There were a lot of functionalist teachers at that time, and this was a typical first-year studio. Make an 8 by 8 by 8 cube and give everything that you need: sleeping, eating, work table, everything in that 8 by 8 cube. So all the students, there were like 80 students, were working away, and I drew what I called psychological space. I said, this doesn't work, this 8 by 8 functionalist cube. And the professors frowned, but they passed me. And later on, Later on, in 2007, when I wrote the book Urbanisms, Working with Doubt, and I believe that the city is the most important human construct, our most important artistic development. I talked about there's a whole chapter on psychological space, which goes into depth some of the problems and the issues, and I think that also has a relationship to that book that we wrote, Questions of Perception. And I have a chance now to look at a project that we're just doing. This is for the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, which is a similar place to this place, dedicated to thought. In fact, their motto is, they exist for thought and for thought's sake. And if you know this place, you'll know that this is Einstein's studio right here. This building, this is Holl, and that little bay window right there is where Albert Einstein spent the last years of his life thinking and working. And this is a wonderful place. It's very ideal. It's not Princeton University. It's about a mile away from Princeton University on a huge acreage, a lot of acreage. And David Rubenstein, the philanthropist, has donated $20 million to do what he calls the Rubenstein Commons building. And the idea is that the scholars will meet, have a place to meet, which has a restaurant and a bar and a fireplace and a pool table, a place where right now they can't meet because there's cafeteria-style eating and it's over at 1 o'clock and it doesn't play on Sunday. So that's what this building is about. It's about meeting, it's about interaction, it's about bringing people together. And therefore I had to check it with the authorities. And I had a good response from Einstein, and Le Corbusier thought it was an okay deal too. So when this was a competition, we were against some pretty heavy hitters like Rem Koolhaas and Todd Williams and Billy Tsen, and we won. I was very excited, but there's a simple idea of intertwining science and the arts, intertwining with nature. This idea of the humanities and science and nature as an intertwine. The whole building is about this intertwining. And the building is a kind of social condenser, a place where people meet. And the building is also about light, prismatic light. And as I said, I won't go into this in detail because I have a lot of things I want to cover. But as we develop the building, I'm trying to get the level of ideas. They're a great client, by the way. Every time we have a meeting, it's extraordinary. I think we had a meeting right after the 4th of July. You know how when you go to a meeting where there's like 18 people in the room and someone wants to talk about soccer or sports or something to break the ice? So we talk about that wonderful moment on the 4th of July when we got close to Jupiter, Juno, the satellite. And, it's a world in its own, this group of people, fantastic. So the curves in this building where the billowing light comes through are what I call space curves, curves that are made out of two non-planar geometries. So you'll get this condition of the light that has to do with, but one of the nice things is the director said when we presented our scheme, he said, first of all, I said, early in the project, I said, most of the new buildings on your campus have flat roofs. I noticed the cafeteria has a flat roof. The library has some interesting skylights, but the roofs are very horizontal. I have this impulse to make something, that has more space. And he said, yes, that's for our thought balloons to rise. And in a way, that goes back to my first year architecture psychological space. This notion of the space you need, which is not rationalized. And these are some model studies. It's an ongoing project. And here we go to the room, to the idea of the individual room. I think this is going to play by itself, I hope.
His desire for art, so the sense of music and poetry and painting and sculpture as a foundation that's merging, with the idea of domestic life. So that's a kind of mini utopia. So there's two things. There's the idea that drives the design, which was that musical diagram and the notion of music and the sheet of water and the light. But the most important thing is the body moving through space. And the actual feeling that you get.
For me, you know, architecture really has to be experienced. You have to walk through it. You have to sense the sound. Here we have an acoustic. We have a reverberation time in this gallery of about 1.6 seconds, which is like an old church. And that's because of the stone floor, a honed stone floor, and the hard surfaces and the organization of the proportions. The first moment of entry really is ascending this half stair. And here you're in the center of the composition. You're in the entrance pavilion, the middle of the three, but your view is to the outside. So the excitement really is you're inside, but the focus is the outside. And that outside unifies these three pieces in the feeling of the water, the sheet of water
Unfortunately, the
going
sound
through.
and the visual are completely
Body moving through space is at 5
disassociated.
feet 6 inches. That's where you
I hope that doesn't
experience
happen in
everything.
our minds.
It's very important that this ramp bring you down gently, and you see the horizon of the water start to lift, and you can sense the natural light coming through every cut from the pavilions above. There are secondary cuts in the spaces of the buildings, and that light traveling through, coming to the main gallery below.
Can you just turn
And
the
you can see
sound
the
off
sort
and
of
I can just
active-
explain it? I think it would make more sense. I mean, there's a gallery below, and then there's a guest house and a main house and an entrance pavilion. So the composition creates a sort of outdoor space that connects and brings light down to the gallery below. This is a great client that really wanted the architecture to be very idealistic. And we based the entire project on a work of music, symphony of modules. You can see here the natural light coming through the lenses on the pools above. This is on the gallery floor. And they don't need to turn any lights on. We get 25-foot candles at every wall. That's what I'm saying. I'm telling them, let's cut off their electricity. They don't need to turn the lights on. It opened with the violin concert of a young Korean violinist, and it was really an emotional moment. She sort of had her debut there. And on the upper level, there's a series of floors that are sandblasted glass, so you get this feeling of the connection between the two spaces. It's all in Cabreva wood. There are 55 skylights that come directly from the musical score. There you can see the way the light plays. And this is about how it connects to the outside. Even though it's a contained space, the water connects in east and west to the space beyond in both directions. And there's a community in Kangbuk in Seoul. And for me, every detail is important, every connection, the way two materials come together, the way the joints are articulated. Here's a carved wooden door handle. I think wherever your hand touches the architecture, there's a tactile dimension that is something very important in the overall experience. And in this case, we did all the light fixtures and all the furniture in the house. And what's interesting about this project is it was based, as I said, on a piece of music by Holl. The music was written in 1969, and it required over 200 in the orchestra, so the piece of music was never played. And the house, when it was published, it went online, and there was a lot of information about it, and the widow of the composer sent us a letter and said, "Dear Mr. Holl, I just noticed a piece of my husband's music had become a house, and it's so amazing that this piece of music now has a life because he never got to have it played." So she had a whole, wonderful feeling about the fact that this piece of music had a second life as a house. This is a quote from Lebbeus Woods, the late Lebbeus Woods. I worked with him, a brilliant architect who understood light is the main thing. Light is a natural phenomenon, the complexities of which reveals the structure of human consciousness. Objects, including buildings with their absorption and reflection of light, stimulate a human brain's neural networks, in effect, activating the brain. The more complex and nuanced the stimulation, the more fully the brain comes to life. So this is something Lebbeus and I, for years, have discussed, and someone said, "What's your favorite material?" And I've said light, being able to use natural light in different ways, to sculpt in light, to understand light, reflected light, shadows, bounced color, and I think maybe it goes back to my student days. I was still a sophomore at the University of Washington, and I got to go to Rome and live for 10 months, and I had a small apartment right behind the Pantheon. And actually, that was 1970, it's a long time ago. I made a deal with the guard, and he would let me in the morning before the tourists. So I go over there every morning. Every single day was different, and it was an amazing experience. And I was just tracking, actually, the change of the seasons, or when it would rain. Down through that huge oculus, this silvery light would come down, the raindrops would come down, and then, of course, the Romans had all planned it out, so there were these beautiful cuts in the marble, and it was drained away. Or in wintertime, when the sun is very low and it doesn't penetrate very deeply into the space, maybe this is where, maybe the combination of living behind the Pantheon for 10 months and growing up in the Pacific Northwest on Puget Sound, overlooking Yukon Harbor, which faces Seattle and Manchester. That's where I was born. So the first 16 years of my life, I was watching the sun rise over this body of water. And I think those two aspects brought light and this kind of phenomena of reflection of light central to my nervous system, maybe epigenetically imprinted, and my daughter will understand this epigenetically, possibly. I never thought of that. I just thought of it right now. If you ever want to see one building, I would send you to the Chapel of St. Ignatius at Seattle University. 7 bottles of light in a stone box. This is the concept drawing. The idea of mixing the Jesuit program with the quality of light. And the 7 bottles are like the spiritual exercises. I'm not a Jesuit, I'm not a Catholic, maybe I'm a pagan. I do believe in the religiosity of space and the importance of that potential. So I was very honored to be able to do this chapel. And we connected it to the spiritual exercises, a Jesuit activity of the sort of back and forth. A statement is made and another statement in reflection, a kind of exercise, a kind of complementary contrast. So each of these 7 bottles have complementary colors. For example, if you take a blue rectangle and you stare at it for a while, and then you stare at a white piece of paper, you see a yellow rectangle. If you take a green rectangle and you stare at it for a while, and then you stare at a white piece of paper, your eyes form a red rectangle. So using that, let's say, scientific notion, that's how we planned the 7 bottles of light in these contrasting colors. Wherever there's an orange lens, there's a blue field. And it works really interestingly. If you get a chance. And it's always different at different times of day, different times of seasons. It's really a wonderful space that way. And they keep it immaculately. It's the center of the campus. Another kind of light, exciting neural networks. Here's where light disappears. This is the Knut Hamsun Museum, 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Now, what's interesting up there is around the 15th of December, the sun will set and never rise again until about February 5th or something like that. It's just dark. It doesn't, this horizon turns kind of pink and that's it. And there's nothing like the absence of something to make you really appreciate it. And every year I get, from them, I get a picture of the setting sun. So the whole building is organized in this Arctic light, this sort of above the Arctic Circle light. And that's the moment of the disappearance in December, the last moment. But this was a very controversial building, and it took me, it was designed in 1996, and it didn't open until 2009. So it took a long time to realize this building, and at the point we had to move the site. Knut Hamsun is a very controversial figure in Norwegian history, and the site was a controversial thing. But the interesting thing here is that it was in the newspaper across Norway. There are a lot of, this is Nordlandsposten, but it was in many, many newspapers, maybe 300 articles about this building. And a teacher, it was even they even formed a beer tap in a bar and served beer out of the building. And there were cartoons. But the interesting thing is how the media imprints itself on the mind. And here's a teacher who told her students to go out in the landscape and make sketches of vernacular barns and vernacular architecture. And the students came back with pictures of the Knut Hamsun Museum because it was in the newspaper all the time. They didn't see the barns that were actually in the landscape. They saw the Knut Hamsun Museum. So that's a problem, or let's say, whether it's a problem or not, but it's a reality of our time that the media will, in some ways, dominate our minds over the reality. This is a building also based on light, but a light that comes underneath like sleeves. It's Piero Manzoni's, the great Piero Manzoni's collection in Herning, Denmark, and we were thinking of the fabric of billowing sleeves that form conditions of light that shape the space of the museum. And that was opened in 2010. Another condition of light is the Glasgow School of Art across the street from the Macintosh, the very famous Macintosh building, a building which we respected so much. It was we won this in a competition. We're more than doubling the size of the school, and we decided to base it on what we call driven voids of light. And you can see that core piece there, driven voids of light. So what is that doing? That's the structural column, but it's very hollow. It's bringing light down to the studios, and it's also ventilating the entire building. So it's working in several different ways, and the building is all naturally ventilated, and it's a LEED Platinum building. But you can see these driven voids of light, something we invented for that project. And opening next weekend in Iowa is a school of art, 100,000 square feet, based on multiple centers of light. That's the concept drawing. It's a very big square footprint, and I carved out what I call multiple centers of light, bringing light to the studios, to the gallery space, to the ceramic studio, painting studio, sculpture studio. And there you can see those multiple centers. They also form balconies so that the students can get outside of their studio workspace and, I don't know, have a cigarette, I hope not, or spray paint something outside. And so there are these balconies all over. And then in the central, when you actually enter the campus, you can walk through this building and pass by the student art gallery, which is right here to the left. So this is actually coming from this part of the campus. You walk right through this building to enter the campus. So in a certain moment, the building becomes like an exposure of the arts to everybody else that's entering the campus. And I'm very excited to make a speech next weekend there at the opening. This is the largest museum under construction in America right now. It's Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, which we also won in a competition. And the concept was a luminous canopy in Texas, in Houston, Texas, where that big sky has a feeling of, let's say, pushing down on you. It's so blue and large. I had this idea, this sketch, that the whole, let's say, roof of the building would be convex and concave and reflect this. And that becomes the whole gallery level, bringing the light down. And then the building itself is sheathed in what I call a cold jacket. It gets very hot in Houston, so when the sun hits the wall of this building, these are tubes of glass, like this big around, and the sun hits the wall, and they're hollow at the top and the bottom, so it relieves the heat by 90%. The solar gain is on the building is reduced by 90%. And over the galleries, and some models of the galleries, and there's a model of this is a mock-up of the skin of the building, which are these empty tubes, sandblasted. Of course, they'll have a gorgeous reading at night as the light of the building gives them a certain glow, but they're also working as a reducing the solar gain on the building on the outside. And thank God for China, because this was going to be over budget everywhere. Spain, Germany, whatever, people making the samples. And I'm glad to have an office in Beijing. And I think free trade is very important. I mean, we're an international, we're a global, everything about this earth is global. The oceans are global. We have to do everything together. This idea of closing trade is ridiculous. Anyway, this building wouldn't exist without the openness of our day that they have the technology, and they have the will, and they produce these for a third of anywhere else that we could get them, and therefore we're going to have this wall, this wonderful luminous cold jacket wall in Houston. It's a new idea, and I don't know any building that has that, and I'm very excited about it. And that's going to be, it's right across the street from Mies van der Rohe, by the way. This is the original building here. There's Mies van der Rohe's only museum in America, and that's a Moneo building, and this will be our building here. So it's a very important place in Houston. Urbanistically, we're also doing the Glassell School. I won't go into detail. Like I say, I shouldn't. I'm talking about my buildings when I should be talking about the 5 points, which I said I would do, right? So I'm already going off track. So the last is this idea of city, room, and body and space. That is, that the condition of space, the condition of spatial experience affects us at every scale. From the city, very important to have spaces formed in the city, like this Chengdu project, but from the room, like that house, the intensity of a small room is very important, but also even from the idea of the body. And we made a house recently from a series of explorations, which we call explorations of the inside, from intersecting spheres. But also, we did a dance set for Jessica Lange, dance company, and she came to me and said, this was part of the Architecture Biennale in Chicago. Sarah Herder invited us, and Jessica and I had equal love of Morton Feldman and John Cage and Ioannis Xenakis, so the music we already agreed on. And she said, well, what would be the structure? And I said, well, why don't we start it with my first-year architecture studio structure that says that there's only 4 kinds of architecture: under the ground, in the ground, on the ground, and over the ground. She said, fine. So this piece it's 20 minutes, and 5 minutes under the ground, 5 minutes in the ground, 5 minutes on the ground, and 5 minutes over the ground. And here's a little bit of it, right? Just a short moment of it. So that will be premiered in the City Center on October 7th, 8th, and 9th in New York. It's going to go to Houston. It'll be at the University of Washington. It'll be at the Mini Theater on 10th and 11th of November, and it's traveling all around. And that was a revel. I'd never done dance stage sets, and I didn't realize you had to do the design so they could wrap it up in ski bags and carry it on the airplane. So all of that can travel. Anyway, that's my talk today, and I think I veered away a little bit from this notion of dividing this into these five categories. And I just go back to say that maybe the first drawing is the most important drawing of this notion of environment, body, brain, and idea of mind. And I remember this wonderful Italian statement, architecture una cosa mentale. I would end with that. Do we want questions?
Questions?
Yeah, we can take questions. We can have questions. Yeah.
I'm interested in a couple things. One is when you said you were looking at all the flat roofs, and your impulse was to create
Right.
In terms of neuroscience, where is that idea, where is that feeling of I have the impulse to
Right.
come from?
That's an intuitive feeling. I have to tell you a little story. She's, at the Institute of Advanced Studies, where I proposed to do something which was, vertical and not a flat roof. An interesting thing, Robert, the director, made all the architects that are competing meet together, right? So there's Todd and Billy and Rem Koolhaas and everybody sitting at a big table, 20 people sitting at a table. And walking into the room, after we toured the campus, I told him this idea that I was having. I just have this intuitive feeling that, and then he said, well, why don't you share that with everyone here? I said, absolutely not. These are my competitors.
I guess then the second half of my question has always fascinated me, and I had a professor, actually, he was a student of Lou Kahn and worked for Lou Kahn. His name was Jan Holt, and he was at the Virginia Tech. He just retired last year. But when Jan would come to my desk for critiques, he would he'd be very quiet and still, and then he would actually make this sound in his head, this sound under his breath, like, as he was figuring out what I was thinking and what he was going to respond. And so part of my interest is, what is this moment of and I feel it in your work, and so I was wondering if you could talk about it.
And I think the creative aha moment is in every field. It's in music, it's in painting, it's in sculpture, it's in science. And there's nothing more joyful than that feeling. And that's why I can't go on vacation. While I was gone for 3 weeks, I never take that much time off. I designed a library in Malawi, Africa. And we have this wonderful client from Korea. He's now dedicating his resources to a university in Malawi, one of the poorest countries in Africa. And the first building he's already built a hospital, but the first building he's going to build is a 60,000 square foot library. And I was having some ideas, and I made them on my watercolors, and I photographed them, and I sent. This is how I work. I do a watercolor 5x7, I take a shot, and I send it to the Beijing office and to the New York office. And when I got back, there was a beautiful model, and I said, wow, it's there, this first schematic. I can show him. I can go to Malawi. I can show him the first scheme. And therefore, I felt like, wow, that was the most exciting thing that happened on my 3-week vacation. She helps. She's an architect. And she was criticizing and helping me, you know, and also my 8-month-old daughter is a critic too. She takes the watercolor and shakes it. Oh, it's collaborative.
Hi, Eve Edelstein. Yesterday we were talking about your morning ritual of painting, drawing every morning, where you go into that zone, that moment, and draw. And I'd started to quiz you about the environmental features that settle you into that activity. And I think what we're here to do with the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture is to understand what happens during the intuitive moment where the space either supports or disrupts this activity, and how perhaps you manipulate your interaction with that space to get you back to the zone. I understand the concept of the intuitive moment, but what we're really trying to do is to explore deeper into that subconscious mode.
Well, when you're talking about the space itself, it's the 5x7 watercolor pad and your mind. And that's how I can function anywhere on the earth, because I can pull down an airplane tray and I can put this out and I can work because I'm concentrating on this. So it's not, in that case, it's not necessary to be in some sort of wonderful space. You can do this almost anywhere. But I feel that that the subconscious, I think everybody dreams, and when you dream, you're working in places that you don't know where, and right when you wake up in the morning is when you're connected to that, and that's why I always work. Before I talk to anyone, I never read the newspaper in the morning. What a terrible thing to do to your mind, especially now. It's awful, you know. So I think that's sort of a sensitive place to have a cup of green tea, maybe a little Morton Feldman music, and just work for an hour. And then I have breakfast, and then I go to the office and other things happen. But the nice thing about this ritual is every day I feel like there's been a creative act already, somehow. And to me, that's like the most exciting feeling that you can have. And as an architect, it's central to your work. You have to have an idea for the project. So, and you never know how long it's going to take. Someone said, how long will it take you to do this building? I says, well, I can tell you how long it will take to do the working drawings or the design development or the construction, but I can't tell you how long it's going to take me to have the idea. That's why we lose a lot of commissions. You know? And we want the idea like that, but you can have the idea. It's possible, but not always. And you know when you have the idea, and you know when you don't have the idea, which, a lot of architects fake themselves, right? They never had an idea, and they just build it, whatever it was they drew. Anything else? There's one back there.
Bob Condiac, Kansas State. Stephen, I want to edge into this very carefully, but for this audience, you made a logical leap between psychological space and then did the architect thing. You talked about light. Can you fill in between your idea of psychological space and why light is the answer to that?
I don't think I said that light was the answer. I think that light is this notion of exciting neural networks, which that's Lebbeus-Wood's statement. I think that light is key in that, and I think that there's an inspirational quality that happens, and that it's hard to explain exactly how powerful that can be. I just think about last night when everyone was up here on the courtyard watching the sunset, and they're like trying to photograph. You can't photograph that. They're trying with their cameras. They're trying to photograph, and we're standing there in this incredible space, and the sun disappears, in that mist, and then everybody applauds. I mean, it's an emotional thing, and I think the psychological space is everywhere, right? When you're in the subway, I mean, an example of this sort of elimination of psychological space is Penn Station. I don't know if you ever stand in Penn Station, but it's like flat, it's like compressed, it's very nerve-wracking space. And if you look back at what McKim, Mead, and White had before, what an enormous, amazing place that was. So there, in urbanistic terms, on a grand scale, is the functional elimination of a gigantic psychological space that we need for the health of the city. Hopefully, they'll change Penn Station. I have to use Penn Station all the time, and I'm amazed at what a miserable, kind of condition. So, I mean, I think psychological space is everywhere. I mean, I have an example of an airplane, right? A fuselage, and I'm from Seattle, so I'm very pro-Boeing, and I had a chance to ride on the 787, the Dreamliner, several times from Beijing to Seattle, and just the added dimension of the fuselage and the larger windows really makes a big difference. Small details make a big difference in space and light, and they're connected, but they're not. It's not a one-to-one relationship.
Oh.
Curious, from the perspective of looking at your career, how would you say the process of what you do changed from when you were a young architect to where you are today? It's really sort of a two-part question. I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday who comes at things from the psychological aspect, suggesting that we're still asking the same questions we were asking 30, 40 years ago.
Right.
And wondering how come we're not asking questions in a different way.
Well, I think that's what's exciting about this conference. And one of the reasons why Dimitra and I decided, that I needed to come here and not go on the honeymoon, right? And because today, with the breakthroughs, what we know now that we never could know before, I mean, it's amazing scientific knowledge that I'm very excited about learning about. And I think it gives us more confidence to act on our intuition in different ways, and perhaps a better argument for the importance of architecture. There was a moment when I came of age that was called The Language of Postmodernism, written by Charles Jenks. And in that book it says, architecture, can't change the way we live, forget about it. It's not going to make better housing or whatever. And he had the collapse of Pruigo and all of that rest. And it was a very cynical moment, and they made a lot of very ugly, eclectic buildings in the wake of that moment. And I was still working for modern architecture and trying to do my things. But coming full circle now, I'm doing a Maggie's Cancer Care Center in London. It's under construction. And this is a program directed by Charles Jenks because his wife Maggie died. And as you might know about this series of buildings, this will be the 10th building. The premise is that architecture gives an environment of healing just out of the inspiration of the space, the geometry and they're using, Rem Koolhaas did one, Zaha did, Richard Rogers. They're only using architects that try to make really intense architecture. And there's a healing capacity to this. And Charles Jenks wrote this book recently called The Architecture of Hope about these Maggie centers. And I said, hey, Charles, by the way, you're going 360 degrees on your 1972 book. Well, yeah, maybe, yeah. So what's exciting, I think, about today is there's new evidence. People like Charles Jenks have given up the cynicism, and the science can add a dimension to this. And I'm not a positivist on that, by the way. I don't believe that you're going to find a formula and give rules. That's not going to happen. That's why if you remember my diagram, that little dotted line around mind is enormously important. That's the individual, that's the soul, that's the spirit, that's the creative spark, that's the uniqueness, and that has to continue. There's never going to be a formula. You can't give a building code. No matter what we find out, it's not a positivistic route, in my opinion. So maybe I'm going to be the conference bad boy that way.
Oh, I have the microphone. I just happen to have one. My name is Lily Robinson. I'm from New York, but I teach here in San Diego. I had a pivotal moment in my life. I was actually on an elevator with you and my friend Brad, and we were at 133 West 19th Street. This was in the early 90s, I think. And I was like, oh, that's Stephen Holl, you know. And you turned to Brad and you said, hey, I hear you're implementing CAD in David Hunter's office. And I was wondering what you thought about it. You do not remember this?
No.
And you said, you know, do you have any advice about AutoCAD or something like that? And then you had a conversation, you got off the elevator. And so I'm seeing you once again, many years later, and I wondered, you know, you show beautiful, beautiful watercolor renderings, and you have these designs, and you know that come from your hand. And I wonder, since that moment to here, how technology or CAD or any of these other technologies that we're talking about here at the conference, which is collecting data, how do you feel about that, and how do you integrate it?
We use the maximum technology in our office. We have super fast computers. I connect Beijing to New York. We have go-to-meeting Skypes every week. We have the largest 3D printers that you can buy. But I believe that the moment of the creative moment is something that needs to be analog, from the brain to the hand to the idea, and then it can go to the digital. The digital is a limited path. I mean, now I'm going to get into territory I'm not sure of, but there's something like 100 billion neurons in the mind, and each one of them has something like 7,000 synaptic connections. Imagine, there's no computer even close to that. And that's why, especially in the sensitivity of things like painting, sculpture, and architecture, the beginning point needs to be an analog point. You can go then completely digital as quickly as you want, and I do it all the time. But that's not the place of origin, and that's why I teach with the. And then, by the way, once we have all the power that we have, it's faster. I can design faster, communicate faster on a 5x7 watercolor than anybody can draw a computer drawing. So it's you could say there's a pragmatic dimension to the way I'm working, and we everything is computerized. There's not a system that we're not on top of, because we have to be. We're only 40 people, and we're doing 9 things under construction and 9 in design with 40 people. I could only do that with the digital power that we have today. But that doesn't underestimate the importance of the analog in the mind.
Stephanie Brick, Sustainable Design Group. As far as light is concerned and working with light as though it's an instrument, can you talk a little bit about how you use that instrument? How you use light as an instrument in harmony with other elements such as water and different materials and things of that nature?
Well, every project is different, and for example, in the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, we have to use sophisticated technology to try to convince the client that we have 25-foot candles at 5 feet 6 off the ground, evenly spaced in every gallery. So Hervé Descott, L'Observatoire, are using full computer power and making hundreds of presentations about this quality of this light. But for me, when I work, I'm working with natural light and models, because I don't think that ray tracing in the computer really tells the truth. By the way, James Turrell, the great artist, works that way as well. And he contends that there's not a program that really accurately traces light. And possibly, and he says, I think it's the quality of light falls off at a distance from the square root of the source that can only be characterized in an actual model. Also, there are these other aspects of the material, the reflectivity of every other surface. So I think it's best to work with actual models in natural light.
And as far as that's concerned, working with light, but in combination with other elements, the way with the gallery, the light shining through the water and reflecting on the floor, and working with different curved shapes to work in that reflection and those forms more.
Right. We're doing speaking of light shining through water, we're doing the Lewis Center for the Arts in Princeton, which will open in about 8 months, which will have the most spectacular light shining through water ever attempted. It's going to. There's a forum bigger than this space with giant squares of glass in the bottom of a pond like this, and the sunlight comes through there and just dances all over the floor of this. It's going to be a great space for Princeton. We got to.
For this wonderful presentation. Again,